Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to yet another Benson video podcast. Today is a very important topic for APUS history, the road to civil war. We have reached this point, this critical point, where we're going to look at an epic struggle. Well, not that epic struggle, another epic struggle. An epic struggle that's going to pit brother against brother, family against family, the most catastrophic event in American history. We're talking about, we're talking about the Civil War, a crossroads. It's been described as a crossroads of our being of the United States. I love this quote that talks about how if you downplay the centrality of the Civil War in U.S. history, it's like not studying the human heart when you're looking at the human body. 600,000 people die, more deaths than all of our wars combined, although we're finally getting to a point where that may not be correct anymore. It is just huge. Historians tend to divide the United States history into whatever happened before the Civil War, whatever happens after the Civil War. To get into it, we talk about a lot of different reasons why the war happened. There's a huge debate even to this day over the causes behind the war and which causes are more important. One thing we have to look at is how America is developing differently. We've been talking about that throughout the year. But let's look at some of the sectional differences between economics and politics, right? We see the regions developing in really different ways. You'll recall that the North is really focused on banking, shipping, wage labor. We could also include factories, industry. It's business, and business is booming, right? And what's the South look like at this time? Plantations, slave labor, right? Remember that the vast majority of whites are living in poverty, right? They're living as subsistence farmers, but we still have this critical understanding of the role of slavery and cotton from the South. And there's a new region that we have to be looking at this time as well, right? And that is, of course, the West, excuse me. The West is this new, really important region in America, and we're going to talk about a place called Porkopolis. Anybody heard of Porkopolis? Porkopolis was the nickname for America's newly third most important industrial center in the country, right? And it is Cincinnati. And Cincinnati was just representative of all these new cities that were growing up in the West: Chicago, St. Louis, Cleveland, Detroit, Milwaukee. Why was the nickname Porkopolis? Because it was the central location where all the pork was being brought from all of the farms in the Ohio River Valley to be processed into food, to be put onto trains and steamboats and ships and sent to feed the burgeoning populations of these cities, whether they were in the West or the big old cities of the East. The cities are booming in the West and all over America for that matter, but especially in the West and to some degree the North. And we'll talk about that even more after the Civil War, but it has begun now. There's no question, right? Let's also note that it's the commercialization of agriculture. There's the image of the great independent family farmer, and that is a true part of what was going on, but also very quickly we see the coming together of these farms into bigger and bigger farms owned by smaller and smaller numbers of people or by certain organizations. Let's talk about political objectives. So what does the North want? When people are voting, when they're turning to their government, what do they want to see? They want high tariffs, right? They want to help the local industry. They want federal assistance and aid for infrastructure, roads, and things that will help and increase trade. They want open immigration, right? And they also want to see a containment of slavery, right? There's a big sense of we don't want to spread slavery to new territories. People weren't opposing slavery very often or talking about ending slavery. That existed, but it was still pretty radical. The South, of course, is the opposite with the tariff, right? They want the low tariff. They want to see and they depend on an expansion of slavery, especially because of the burgeoning populations of the North and the political competition going on there. They also want or are not interested in immigration anywhere nearly as much, right? What does the West want, politically speaking? Infrastructure. They live and die by infrastructure. They need a way to get all of their farming, all of their produce, everything that they're creating and growing and making, and they need to get it to the cities. That's how business will survive. There's no strong support for infrastructure unless you get to the southern new territories that are as the West spreads out. But for the most part, no strong sense of that there. Right, so that gives you a little background of the regions and how they're developing. Let's dive into the history. This is my section that I called Diarrhea and the Presidency. A little gross, yeah, but an interesting historical connection, right? So this is the election of Cass, whose nickname was Gas, right, or jackass. He was the Democratic candidate, and he was a general, a famous general. And he's running against another very famous general, Zachary Taylor, one of the big heroes, old rough and ready, who is of the Whig Party, right? And Zachary Taylor has his vice presidential candidate, Millard Fillmore. There was no real big difference in policy. There was no major platform. The Whigs were tired of Clay, who kept running and losing. And so they picked a guy with almost no political experience. He had just come out of the Mexican-American War, right? And then we're also going to have a third-party candidate, and it's none other than Martin Van Buren. Remember Andrew Jackson's old vice president who had a catastrophic presidential term. He's going to run for the Free Soil Party. He's going to run on this platform of supporting the Wilmot Proviso and free soil, free speech, free labor, and free men. Here's a political cartoon that was kind of making fun of, to some degree, or maybe actually you could say in support of almost, Martin Van Buren. He's there with his son. There was a group of Democrats called the Barn Burners. They were trying to literally like burn the barn down. In other words, make slavery this big issue. And up there we have, I believe that's supposed to be Cass, the Democratic candidate. Is he going to support slavery? Is he going to be against slavery? What's going to be his stand on slavery? If they burn the barn down, he'll have to jump off. And you see the mention in the cartoon to Davy Wilmot talking about the Wilmot Proviso, of course. And here's another one that's sort of definitely making fun in this case of Martin Van Buren, where you see him trying to straddle from the Democratic platform, because he was a former Democrat, over to the Whig abolition platform. There were more abolitionists with the Whigs, certainly, than there were with the Democrats. And there he is thinking about trying to make this leap. Again, just another cartoon addressing the election at the time. Basically, you can see what happens here. Van Buren does quite well for a third-party candidate. He's got that 10% of the vote there, but it's not even enough to get a single electoral vote. But it's enough if you added all of his votes to one person or the other to completely sway the election. In the end, of course, Taylor wins. He is our successful Whig president. Whoopee! We're very excited to get this. We haven't had a lot of Whig presidents, right? So Taylor becomes the president. And remember, he's replacing Polk. Polk didn't run again. Polk was a Democrat. He didn't run again because of his persistent and horrific diarrhea as one possible reason. Also, he accomplished everything he wanted. Zachary Taylor, our military hero, becomes president. And 2 years into his term, he's not looking so good. And he eats, famously, at the White House, a meal or a snack of cherries. Lots of cherries, along with some milk. And I'm going to highly recommend that you never combine these two, because what happens to Taylor is he dies. Terrible kind of dysentery. It's a mess. Some people think maybe he was poisoned. Others say it was just the cherries and the milk together. I don't know. But he dies in office, and suddenly we have Millard Fillmore, a Whig vice president. And there's a famous saying, God save us from Whig vice presidents. Remember what happened when William Henry Harrison died and Tyler took over and went against everything the Whigs stood for. Millard Fillmore does a little bit of that, right? He doesn't really support the Whig platform very strongly. He will be kind of, Taylor and Whig are there for the famous 1850 Compromise, which we'll get into in just a minute. But we have a couple of years of Millard Fillmore, a president who will serve as president but never actually be elected president. Which brings us to the topic of popular sovereignty, right? And we have to move on to this idea of popular sovereignty. It was an idea really started by General Cass, and it was this idea of self-determination, right? It was an idea of self-determination, the idea that if we're going to talk about slavery in the United States, what we should do is allow the people to vote, because it's America and we vote and we're democratic, right? And so let each region and each territory decide if they want to have slavery or not. The problem is that's going to dismantle things like the 1820 Compromise that already said certain regions could and couldn't have slavery. But we'll get into that. All right. We already saw the sneak preview of the gold rush, 1849. This is the big news of the time period. They found gold, and enormous amounts of people, thousands and thousands of people, are rushing to California to try to strike it rich. Of course, the vast majority who go will never strike it rich. There was an expression that those who mined the miners were the ones who made it. Those who set up shops and ran businesses that supplied and supported the miners were the ones who made it. Because for every successful miner, there was 10,000 failed miners. And it was a rough and tumble, Wild West kind of atmosphere. This was a stamp commemorating it. But of course, a huge population of the miners were also from all over the world, in particular from China. Let's get into the Compromise of 1850, one of the most important parts of this time period. This is sort of what's going to replace the Compromise of 1820. You got to keep in mind that the South was doing really well coming up to 1850. They had President Taylor, right, a Southern slave owner, Virginia-born, although he's considered a Louisiana candidate. They had a majority of slave owners in the cabinet. They had a majority of slave owners on the Supreme Court. They had an equal number of senators who supported slavery as opposed to those who came from places without slavery. The only place that Southerners and the slave-holding ideas came into a minority was in the House of Representatives. And that House of Representatives kept on voting for various bills that would put slavery in risk. And they never went anywhere, but it was enough to really make the Southerners paranoid and freaked out, right? And now California wants to come in. California becomes a state in 1850, and how that happens is absolutely going to be critical for what happens next, right? And so this becomes this huge, big debate. Our famous senatorial giants come back, Clay, Calhoun, Webster. They've been around since the War of 1812. This is their last great attempt to save the nation, and they'll do a decent job, right? The idea will be that California will come in as a free state. So as you can see there in the green on the left, California is a free state. And then the Northerners will agree to stricter, stronger fugitive slave laws. They'll write a very strict, very intense fugitive slave law to make sure that slaves aren't running away, because Southerners are obsessed with this. And then the slave trade would be banned in Washington, D.C., right? And then we would allow for popular sovereignty to come to the new territories of Utah and New Mexico. So that would set a whole new trend and a whole new precedence for having more of this idea of popular sovereignty. So it would give the Northerners, or at least the non-slavery folks, a slight balance or advantage in the Senate, but only temporarily, because it was pretty expected that New Mexico territory would eventually vote for slavery. One of the most offensive, horrific parts of this compromise was the new fugitive slave law. And this became a huge issue, right? Look at these ads in the newspapers. Be on your guard, and arrest is planned. The fugitive slave law, which disregards the ordinary securities of personal liberty. And you have a slave in chains. Am I not a man and a brother? One historian wrote that it seemed like everybody went to sleep before the Compromise of 1850 was announced, and then they woke up and they were all abolitionists. And that's exaggerating the case, but it was becoming more and more acceptable. This radical movement was becoming more and more mainstream, because there was this horrific image of black, free men and women who'd been living amongst their neighbors in the North, who were suddenly getting just yoinked out and taken away and returned back into slavery, right? So that's our Compromise of 1850. As I said, it's truly the last act of our senatorial giants. The great nullifier Calhoun dies before it's finally agreed upon. Clay will pass his leadership on to Stephen Douglas of Illinois and kind of retire, and soon enough he'll be gone as well. And we go on from there, right? This slide appears to be out of order. Yes, indeed. We'll get back to this in a minute. This is talking about the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty, and you'll see Nicaragua there. I don't know how it got out of order. I apologize, but we're going to go on. The 1852 election. Great saying, we polked them in 44 and let's pierce them in 52, right? So James K. Polk was the Democratic candidate back in 44 and won, and the Democrats are going to come back with Franklin Pierce. Who is Franklin Pierce? Well, let's talk about that for a minute. This election will also kind of represent the death of the Whig Party, the end of the Whig Party. Although they had quite a hero, old Fuss and Feathers, General Winfield Scott, another popular person from the Mexican-American War. The Whigs will be painfully split, though, during this election between the anti-slavery folks and Southern Whigs, of course, who could never support that. And it will really represent a demise of the Whig Party and an end of truly national parties and a real sectionalism, and kind of seals one of the final nails in the coffin of moving us towards the Civil War. Now, one of the interesting things about Franklin Pierce is that he is truly a dark horse in the Polk tradition. Right? They could not pick a candidate, and Franklin Pierce didn't really want to run. He had enough of his own scandals and things that he was pretty concerned about it. I believe he was the head of the Democratic Party in New Hampshire, fairly popular guy, but he said, if they can't pick somebody, then you can turn to me. And after 49 ballots, they finally did say, we're going to turn to you. And actually, I think it was about the 40th ballot, but on the 49th ballot, Pierce was chosen, right? And he will run, as I said, against Winfield Scott. Here's a cartoon. Pierce is on the right, Winfield Scott's on the left. Who do you think is being made fun of more? You have Pierce saying, "Oh dear me, I shall faint. I knew I shall faint. It's constitutional." And on the other side, you have Winfield Scott saying, "What's the matter, Pierce? Feeling faint? Ha ha ha." So in fact, they're making fun of what happened to Pierce when he was a general during the Mexican-American War on some battle in Mexico. I forget the name of it. They were supposed to charge, and he got injured on his leg, and he was feeling really faint, and he couldn't keep up with his soldiers. And then on another attack, he tried to charge, and he did in fact faint. And so that didn't look great. And people love to make fun of him for that on the other side. But he wins, right? Quite dramatically, actually, in the electoral vote. The popular vote is not a slaughter by any means, but in the electoral vote, because of the Whigs being split, it's a massacre, right? And so now Pierce is our new president. Pierce is a president whose presidency will be just torn with tragic sadness. After being elected, on their way to Washington, they're in this horrible train accident. Their train falls off the tracks and rolls down, and their son Benny, pictured here on the right, is killed in this train accident. And him and his wife survive, and she sees it as punishment for him trying to run for such a high and powerful office, and she doesn't even end up going to Washington with him in the end. And his deep sadness he'll never really, of course, be able to recover from, and it's a big thing. And then his vice president, William King, he will die within about a year into Pierce's presidency, and there was no constitutional way to allow for a new vice president, so he didn't have a vice president for most of his campaign. Pierce will then turn his attention on expansion. But before that, one more thing in the notes, the fire eaters versus the radical abolitionists or the barn burners. We really saw at the end of that election this division. The fire eaters is a word for Southerners who at all costs want to spread slavery and want to increase slavery, even bring back the international slave trade. They really see slavery as central and critical, and so they are the hardcore supporters of it and apologists for it. And then on the other side, we have the radical abolitionists who want to end slavery at all costs. And as we see more and more people going into these two camps, we see that it becomes harder and harder for any hope of change, right? But let's go back to that slide that was slightly out of order that talked about the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty and this issue of expansion. So William Walker is an American adventurist who goes down to Nicaragua and actually manages to take over Nicaragua and become the president of Nicaragua for like about a year before he's executed in Honduras for meddling in Central American affairs. But this was all related to kind of a Southern plan that was growing with the help of the fire eaters to spread the United States, make it bigger and bigger, with part of the reasoning being that we'd have more slave states. On top of that, that Clayton-Bulwer treaty that I showed you earlier was all about the U.S. and the United Kingdom coming together. This was before there was a Panama Canal, and it seemed like it would be a better plan to put the canal in Nicaragua. And it's obviously a lot wider there. We could go back real quick to that slide so I can show you. Here you can see the Nicaragua one. Obviously, it's a lot wider, but what you don't see in that kind of a map that they often show you is that it's still a shorter route to some degree than Panama. When we go back, sorry about that, this San Juan River that you can see, if you look up there on the map on the right, you can get a ship all the way from the Atlantic up the San Juan to Lake Nicaragua. So all you needed was this little narrow thing. This was the chief passageway, in fact, that people were taking back in those days when they went from San Francisco to New York. They went through Nicaragua. It was easier than going all the way down to Panama because it was just that little transit road that you needed to travel, and that was it. And so the British and the Americans had kind of agreed on this canal, and it ended up falling apart, of course, when William Walker was assassinated or killed. Let's look at Asia really quickly as well. We have this famous Treaty of Wangxia, 1844, in which it's our first treaty with the Chinese. It gives Americans the right of extraterritoriality. In other words, we can do whatever we want in China without having to follow their laws. We follow our laws. It helps us catch up with the British. It's a big part of what's called the beginning of China's century of dishonor, where we start to really, along with Europe, try to control Chinese affairs. We'll get into that more later. We're also interested in Japan at the time, and this is just a little cut-off version of the Treaty of Kanagawa, which had to do with a fellow named Admiral Perry, who was sent by Millard Fillmore, but he arrives in this time period, and we also open up Japan with a little show of what's called gunboat diplomacy. This is a Japanese painting of the affair, and we showed up with our brand new navy with our big ships, and we really impressed the Japanese with our strength and power, and they didn't really feel like they had much choice but to kind of open their doors to us. Coveting Cuba, right? So here this big circle shows kind of the plan of the southern states. This is what they wanted to do, and they wanted to spread all these Central American states and Cuba, and especially Cuba, right? So Polk had offered $100 million. Pierce had offered $100 million for Spain. The Spanish, of course, said they would rather sink it than give it to us. But we come into this thing known as the Ostend Manifesto, which was this sort of cloak and dagger backstage kind of thing. James Buchanan, the 15th president, was involved. He wasn't president yet, of course. They were basically trying to, in Belgium in the secret meeting, find a way to get Cuba, either buying it or taking it over with a war against Spain. We were willing to do that. But then when it was seen as being this plan to spread slavery, the whole thing fell apart. And none of that, of course, ended up happening. And then we have to just quickly do the Gadsden Purchase. Again, this is Pierce's expansionism. He had sent a couple of delegates off to try to buy another chunk, and originally he was going to take all of Baja California. A lot of this was connected to the railroads and where the Southern Transcontinental Railroad was going to pass, although that doesn't get finished until after the Civil War. In the end, we just got this little chunk, never managed to get that connection to the Sea of Cortez, which was a little bit short-sighted, but such is life. And we end up with the Gadsden Purchase, $10 million for this little slice so the railroad can go through. I'm going to do one last thing, and then we're going to cut it off. This shows you the Gadsden Purchase again. And that is the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and that's where we'll end it. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was proposed by Stephen Douglas, and the idea was to take this whole new area that was still considered a territory and open it divide it into two, Kansas territory and Nebraska territory, and then open it to popular sovereignty, right? That we were going to allow a vote that would happen after 1854, and this would allow the regions to choose for themselves. So it even wrecks the Compromise of 1850. That thing only lasted like 4 years. And of course, the Compromise of 1820, there's your Missouri Compromise line. There was not supposed to be any slavery up there, but it was pretty clear that it was going to be very, very close in Kansas. My favorite nickname, they called them the Nebraskals, right? Because it was this sort of sneaky taking away some of the old compromises, and now we're starting to really watch things fall apart. We will continue all of this later. Thank you very much. We'll see you in class. Bye.